Okay, so we are already on our second topic for this subject for financial controllership, and for today we will be discussing about internal control and fraud. So before we begin our discussion, let's have the objective for this subject. At the end of the session, the class will be able to first understand what is internal control, fraud, and its role to organization. Second, determine the basic elements of internal control. Third, identify the levels and types of controls. Fourth, determine what is fraud and example. And lastly, identify how to hone fraud situations. Okay, so let's have the first topic, which is the internal control. So perhaps the most important function of the controller is to create and maintain the corporate financial control system. Doing so involves documenting the existing control structure, eliminating redundant controls, and adding new controls to cover potential risks arising from the new business situations. In order to properly assess risk, the controller must have a firm grasp of general types of fraud and how to prevent them. This knowledge should be extended to legally required controls over assets, such as those listed in the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act and Sarbanes-Oxley Act. This chapter and this session provides an overview of this topic. So let's have definition of the internal control. So what is internal control? Internal controls are the mechanism, rules, and procedures implemented by a company to ensure the integrity of financial and accounting information, promote accountability, and prevent fraud. So why it is important to have integrity in terms of your financial and accounting reports? Because it will be the basis of the company by the stakeholder whether to invest or not. So it is very important to have this internal control to prevent fraud for the stakeholders' benefits. So there are three types of control used by the organizations. First, accounting controls. Second, administrative controls. And lastly, primary operational controls. The controller should be aware of the various types of controls that must be interlinked to create a control system that adequately safeguards the company's asset. So these are these three types of controls. So first, accounting controls, which are defined as the plan of organization and all methods and procedures that are concerned with the safeguarding of assets and reliability of financial records. They generally include such controls as the system of authorization and approval, separation of duties concerned with the record keeping and accounting reports from those concerned with operations or asset custody, physical controls over asset, and internal auditing. It was these controls with which historically the independent accountant was primarily concerned. Second, administrative controls, which comprise the plans of organization and all methods and procedures that relate to operational efficiency and adherence to managerial policies, and that usually are concerned only indirectly with the financial records. Included would be such controls as statistical analysis, time and motion studies, performance reports, and employees training programs. Also includes the quality controls. And lastly, the primary operational controls, which concerns the establishment of policy and basis guidelines by which an enterprise will be directed as a means of achieving the business objectives. So given the recent broadening of the traditional definition of controls and those various statements on the subject, it facilitates discussion if the internal control structure of the entity is divided into two parts. So there are two parts of the controls, which we will be discussing on the next slide. Now let's discuss about the types of internal controls structure. There are two types of control structure. First is the control environment, and the second is the accounting system. So what is control environment? It is the corporate atmosphere in which the accounting and other controls exist, and in which the financial statements are prepared, where the accounting system are the set of accounting processes with integrated procedures. Now, how do we identify the activities, risks, and control objectives? One way to identify a company's principal activities and control objectives is to separate the typical company into four basic operating components and define the control objectives of the various activities in each component. Suggested components are sales, productions, or service, finance, and administration. So, kanang upat ka component, imo na siyang bulagon para ma-identify nimo ang mga activities and if there are risks or how to control those activities. So what are the examples of controls objectives? So in terms of self-controls objectives, we could have this kind of objectives wherein that correct billings are produced for shipped products or services rendered. Customers' credit is checked prior to approving orders and customers' return are approved. So pag bill pa lang nimo sa imong mga gipang ship out na mga products, imo nang gi-insure, imo nang gi-check ang mga orders nila dadto kung sakto. Kung unsa ang imong gi-deliver, mao ba ang na-receive sa customers. Second, production or service control objectives. That minimal scrap occurs as products are created. The correct quantities of products are produced and pilferage is kept to a minimum. So in terms of production, we ensure that all the items or all the inventories are properly utilized para ma-lessen nato ang mga scrap or katong mga useless, mahimog useless ang inventory. So we make sure that the inventory that we need are being used o kung asa gid sila dapat gamiton. So next, finance control objectives. That cash receipts are deposited on the day of receipt. Petty cash is insured only with proper authorization. So when we receive the cash, dapat on the day pud ana ma-deposit na pud na siya. So kung naapoy petty cash nag-i-issue, we ensure that there is a proper authorization. Kung kinsa lang ang makadawat sa petty cash or kinsa lang ang person na responsible ato, sila lang pud ang mag-assist, sila lang pud ang magperma. And in terms of bad debt, they are properly authorized before being removed from the receivables ledger. So in terms sa atong mga bad debt, kanang mga unsure nga mga ma-receive nimo in terms of receivables, so gina-insure nimo kung katubag yun na mga people or katubag yun na mga debts are really recognized as bad debt. So kung kailangan ba yun i-write off. Next, administration control objectives. For example, that office equipment is purchased only with the proper authorization. So we ensure that the assets that we buy are duly approved by the CEO or by the director or by the person's purchase request na person na mag-allow nga magpalit ana. So dili lang ta in terms of the asset, dili lang ta pataka o palit sa mga butang. So we ensure that those assets that we buy are properly approved by the approving responsible person. So vacations are taken only with previous authorization. So in terms kung magbakasyon mo, you ensure that it is approved by your supervisor. So dili lang ka kung na if you are already working in an office, we ensure that your vacation should be approved by your supervisor. So, once na mag-post ka sa FB, dili na ka makonsensya because ang imong supervisor nag-allow sa imo na mag-vacation. And hiring occurs only after proper authorization. So, in terms of hiring pod, dili ka mag-hire na naapadara ang tao. We ensure that the hiring process is being followed. So, you cannot hire pa if the person is still there. So, there must be a proper channel in terms of hiring. So, you need to ask for example, the reason of the hiring is a resignation of the person. So, there must be a proper resignation letter. So, para ma-inform po ka at the same time pud siya ug ma-preparean pud sa organization. So there must be a proper channel. Now, understanding control system. When reviewing the flowchart for control weaknesses, 5 general control objectives should be kept in mind. So what are these 5 general control objectives? So first, authorization. Was the transaction authorized by management? This should be evidenced in general way by establishing related policies, contract authorization limits, investment limits, standard price list, and so on. Or in a given situation, a specific authorization may be needed. So in terms sa kanang magbuhat kag transaction with the management, there should be a written documents to prove that you are being authorized. For example, kung magpalit ka, naguba ang inyong printer sa office, so there must be a written request na mag-repair ka ato na machine or kato na equipment approved by your supervisor or approved by the owner of the company. Second, recording. Transactions should be recorded in proper account at the proper time. So, proper cut-off with the proper description. No fictitious transaction should be recorded, and erroneous materials or incomplete description should be avoided. So, there should be a proper recording of the transaction. Kung pila ang amount, kung unsa na item, kung unsay description. So, all of those items or descriptions of the equipment should be listed or should be recorded. For example, nagpalit ka printer. So, i-indicate ni mo dadto pila iyang amount. Unsa ba siya na kind na printer? Canon ba? HP ba? Or unsa pa man ang mga kind sa printer? So, pwede pod imong i-indicate na colored siya. Pwede pod black or white. So, just a little description of that items. Pwede pod ang uban, there is a number, serial number na kina-indicate nila sa ilahang equipment. So, that is part of the recording as part of the control system. Third, safeguarding. Physical assets should not be under the physical custody of those responsible for related record-keeping functions. So, access to the asset should be restricted to certain designated individuals. So, in terms of safeguarding, gahawid sa custody sa physical asset is dili pod ang katungga record. Why? Because if sila the same ang person na gahawid ato, there will be instances na iyahang i-manipulate ang information. Why? Because he probably want to use the physical asset for his own benefits. So, to avoid that, there should be transparency. So, separate ang maghawid sa physical asset at the same time, separate pod ang mag-record. The fourth is the reconciliation. Periodic reconciliations of physical assets to record or control accounts should be made. Some examples are bank reconciliation, securities inventories, and physical inventories of raw materials, and work and process and finished goods to control accounts. So there should be a reconciliation. For example, in terms of bank reconciliation, so the agency, in terms of the Department of Agriculture, we have this agency's records. So we have our own records of disbursement of money. At the same time, we ask bank statement from the land bank. In terms dayon ana, our agency records and then ang land bank records, we make compares of those balances. So amo silang hanay-hanayon kung sakto ba ang among gi-disperse o sakto ba ang gi-reflect sa bank. So that is in terms of reconciliation. And then lastly, the valuation. Provision should be made for assurances that assets are properly valued in accordance with generally accepted accounting principles and that adjustments are made. So an example of valuation is determining the depreciation of your transportation. For example, naakay car and the company is using that as a service, especially now with the COVID. Of course, the value of the car is not the same with the value sa pagpalit nimo sa pinakauna pa lang. So there is a depreciations that you need to recognize. And in terms of valuation, it means that you need to make that adjustment on the amount of that asset. So how would you ensure to implement controls in your business? So in terms of cash, there are numerous suggestions. So I just selected some important aspect of the business. So in terms of cash, you could control check stacks, you could control signature plates. So in terms of the government, we have the maximum signatories implemented. So tulo ka buok 3 to 5 ang mag-sign sa amuang documents. Next, separate responsibility for cash receipt and bank reconciliation function. I was able to discuss this na ang mag-prepare or mag-receive sa cash receipt o ang mag-bank recon, they are different people to ensure accountability and transparency of the organization or of the business. Next, perform bank reconciliation. So there should be a reconciliations of the disbursement of your company and in terms in the bank. So there must be a bank reconciliation. Next, reconcile petty cash. Require the bank reconciliations be completed by people independent of the cash receipts and disbursement functions, which I have able to discuss why, for accountability purposes and transparency. Next, required petty cash vouchers to be filled out in ink. Why in terms of ink? So there should be no erasures. Fill out in ink means it is written. Next, compare the check register to the actual check number sequence. So imong i-check ang imong check register kung sakto ba kung ang number sa sequence sa cheque. Next, review uncashed checks. So kung there are stale checks or unclaimed checks, so you need to review. Okay, of course, that will affect the cash. So if there are unclaimed cash, it means that your cash there are available cash to be used. Next, route incoming cash payment through a lockbox. There should be a lockbox for your incoming cash payments. Next, verify amount of cash discount taken. So you need to verify kung naay mga discount na gi-offer so that you could be recognized that as a cash discount. So in terms of investment, there should be an imposition of investment limits. So mag-limits ka kung pila lang ang ma-invest sa imong investors. Next, required authorizations to shift funds among accounts. So for example, nag-invest ang isa pa person, there must be a written authorization if in case your investors want to shift funds to another account. So everything should be documented and everything should be regulated. Next, in terms of your receivables, so There must be confirmed payment terms with the customers. So, nagsabot mo kung unsaon pag bayad sa customers ang iyahang gi-order. So, for instances, kung by credit ba, by check ba, or by cash ba. Next, required approval of bad debt write-off. So, you need, whenever you recognize a bad debt or whenever you write off, meaning imo na siyang giwala or imo na siyang gi-recognize sa nadili na nimo siya makollect. So, there must be approval with the top management. Next, required approve of credit. So, for example, na mangutang sa imong business, no? So, dapat naa siya approval. Dili lang ikaw mismo ang nag-decide. It must be approved by the top management or by the manager or by the CEO. Next, match invoice to the shipping log. So, you must ensure na ang imong gi-invoice o katong imong gipa-ship out is the same. Exactly kung unsa ang sa imong record o unsa pud tong ilang record, there must be a reconciliation. And lastly, verify invoice pricing. So, tan-awon nimo kung ang gi-invoice nimo is sakto ba gyud, no? There are instances, no, na mamali. So, you need to verify. You need to recheck. You need to review your pricings in your invoice. Now, let's discuss about the elements of internal accounting control. So, there are 7 basic elements that are necessary to meet the broad objectives of good internal accounting control. Objectives that include safeguarding the assets against loss arising from intentional or unintentional errors and producing reliable financial records for internal use and for external reporting purposes. So, these elements are: first, competent and trustworthy personnel with clearly defined lines of authority and responsibility. So, we should ensure, or the organization should ensure, that the people that are being hired are honest and competent. Why? Because bisag unsa pa nakatsada sa imong control system sa organization, kung ang mga gipangbutang nimo na mga people incompetent o mga dishonest, dili kaayo trustworthy, ang imo yung financial statement worthless gyud na siya, dili gyud nimo ma-relayan. Kung imo pong gibutang gyud na kay katong mga competent, bisag pag medyo tricky or dili kaayo ing ana ka manindot ang control system, maingon gyud nimo nga ang imong financial statement na gibuhat is reliable. Second, adequate separation of duties. So, ang mag-custody sa physical asset should be different sa mga gabuhat sa record-keeping transaction. So, there must be a accountability and transparency. Next, proper procedure for authorization of transactions. So, there must be a proper communication of who will approve those transactions. So, kung kinsa ang mag-authorize ana na transaction. Fourth, adequate records and documents. So, there must be a proper documentation and record keeping. And then fifth, proper physical control over both asset and records. So, how will you be able to have this kind of or elements of internal accounting controls? So, there must be reconciliation, there must be checking of the asset, and comparing it to the book records. Next, proper procedures for adequate record keeping. So, dapat naa kay procedure sa imuhang pag-records sa mga transaction. So, gikan sa pag-receive, imo na siyang na-record, sunod kung sige buhat, and until imong gi-release, and then hangtod na okay ang document. So, there must be a proper monitoring of the documents. And lastly, a staff that can provide independent verification. So, in terms of level of controls, there are 3. First is the strategic, which are board of directors and top management who plan and control the organizational structures, the corporate goal and objectives, the long-range planning procedures, marketing policy decision-making, management policy decision-making, and financial policy decision-making. So, kaning strategic, they are the top management. Katong mga CEO, katong mga managers, sila ang ga-create sa goals and then mga objectives sa isa ka company or sa organization. Next is the tactical. These are the board of directors and senior management who plan and control the annual profit plans, like the executive personnel policies in terms of inventories, replacement, and also the capital expenditure. We also plan the annual research and development. So, the tactical. And then the third is the operational, where planning and control involves the credit approval practices, the treatment of uncollectible accounts, billing procedures, purchasing procedures, salary and wage authorization, and also the pension plan performance. So that are the 3 levels of controls: strategic, tactical, operational. So consideration has been given to which of the controls a company should be handled at each level, and further, which should be required corporate level as opposed to divisional review and approval. Okay, we are already on the halfway of our discussion. So I just would like to have a short activity. If you're watching this discussion, just like another tricky activity from me, I want you to share your understanding on how important internal control. I want you to comment it on my announcement that I posted and share it to our class. Now, let's have the discussion about the fraud. So, unsa ba gyud ang fraud? Fraud is defined as intentional financial misstatement and misappropriation of funds. So, ang pinaka-importante gyud ani na pag-define sa fraud is ang term na intentional. Meaning, gituyo. Meaning, person is with knowledge nga mali ang iyang gibuhat, mali ang iyahang gi-present. So, once na naay intention na gibuhat and doing that mistake, that is considered as fraud. What are the common types of fraud? So, these are the common types of frauds. First, generate bill from non-existent companies. So, ang isa ka empleyado, nag-generate siya bills sa isa company na wala nag-exist. So, that is considered as fraud. Next, pay personal bills. So, ang isa ka employee pod, nag-incur siya personal expenses. For example, load, diba? That is used for her personal activities. Then, iyang gigamit ang kwarta sa organization. That is considered as fraud. Another, alter approved expense amounts. So, there is an invoice or billing statement and then he altered the documents. Iyang gi-change ang amount. So, that is considered as fraud. Ring bid between purchasers and suppliers. That is considered as fraud. And then submit multiple expense receipt. So, for example, nag-incurred mo transportation expense sa company and then nag-submit siya ka ng multiple expense receipt ato bisag isa lang ka transaction, duwa ka book iyang gi-claim or duwa ka book iyang gi-considered as paid. So that is considered as fraud. And then cancel reimbursement education. And then lastly, sell company asset. For example, na yung mga asset no na wala na nagamit sa company and then na ay isa ka empleyado na iyang gibaligya despite knowing na katunga asset is recognized by the company, that is considered as fraud. So if you're going to ask me, ngano na may fraud sa organization? So these are the causes. First, poor internal controls or poor internal control environment. So ang management dili sila ga-punish or ga-prosecute og mga offenders. So mao gaka-abusar. They also does not set an example of high ethical standard. So usually kung ang top management kung ga-practice na sila kanang fraud, ang ila pong lower management ana munang makita ug mauna ang mahimog set example. So awaton po na sa uban. So probably that's one of the reason. Next, management does not stress the need for strong control. So wala kay gi-emphasize sa management na dapat imong mag-practice tag-control sa atuang organization. So probably the management is just giving them a kanang free will, no? To make decisions for the organization. There is no concrete basis for their controls. Another, management has not published rules governing ethical conduct. So, walay ethical conduct code of ethics ang company. So, probably that could be a reason. And then, highly placed executives are seen as lavish spender on business trips. So, probably nakita nila sa ilang management, no, na gasto-gasto lang man ni sila, no, wala kaayo nagbantay, wala kaayo nag-practice og mga internal controls. So just like I said, once you see the top management are doing those things, ikaw as a rank and file somehow maawat na pod, no, that will your top management will become your models. So kung unsay ginabuhat sa top management, mao po nang aga-practice sa mga lower level employees. Next, existence of heavy financial pressures of individuals. So probably ang employee medyo daghan siya utang. So there are instances na he will use up the sources of the company. There are also instances that socially unaccepted behavior. So medyo na-addict siya sa gambling or naaba siya yung mga drug, alcohol na mga addiction. So probably that could be reasons. Next, extravagant means of living. So medyo gasto kaayo siya in terms sa iyang living. So probably muuna ang apekto po si iyaha nga mag-decide to practice fraud in the organization. So another, high inflation rates not accompanied by adequate adjustment and compensation. For example, nitaas ang mga bayro nun, ang mga pamaliton, ang bugas nitaas, ang isda na presyo. So probably the financial matters actually affect the employee to practice fraud. And then other sources of pressure. This could be unreasonable profit goals for the company or for a division or subsidiary. And then high rate of management, personnel turnover, or the management operating and financial decisions dominated by a very aggressive individual. The company is also part of declining industry. So for example, ang inyong top management, sige ninyo, na-pressure always ng mga empleyado to strive better. So what if dili man di ay mahatag kung unsa ang goal sa organization. So there are instances na i-manipulate na lang yun sa mga empleyado ang ilahang mga sources or record just to be able to meet the goal of the top management. So that could be the source of or the cause of the fraud. And then lastly, contributing conditions. So there is inadequate hiring practices. So wala kayo gi-check ang mga applicant pag-hire. So there are instances na ang mga na-hire is katong mga dishonest, katong dili mga tarong. And then there is also undesirable personal traits and also unsatisfactory home life. So these are the contributing conditions. How to hone fraud situations. So what tools can be used to hone in quickly on likely fraud situations? So these are the suggestions that may help. First, watch the environment. So as stated several times in this discussion, the environment is a key factor. If management has a low regards for controls, that attitude may rub off on employees. If management uses the company for personal gain, then other employees may feel that it is acceptable for them to do so as well. Of course, the environment may be worse in one area. If so, then the auditor's fraud search should narrow to that area. Next, watch the controls. If control over an area is concentrated in one person's job, then the opportunity for fraud has been presented to the employee. The auditor should not only review such situations, but also recommend splitting responsibilities in order to remove any temptation from the employees. Next, watch employee lifestyle. So some perpetrators flaunt their wealth and bring their gains back to the workplace in the form of fancy automobiles and new clothes. We are not suggesting that the auditors review the parking lot each day, but an inquiring person might want to know why an accounting clerk is driving an expensive sports car. So, no, bantayan yun kung no, travel na dayon ang imuhang boss. So, probably, ito na ni mo maas. Ano, ni kalit man ni siya nagka-car? Ano, nagkakalit man ni siya palit og balay? No? In just one snap of his finger, na siya mga ing-ana na butang. So, kung wala siya ni daog og loto, ana, so probably there is a fraud. So, you need to watch the employee lifestyle. And lastly, be available. Fraud can be surprisingly well known among employees. For the auditor to be told about such situation by employees, availability is crucial. Consequently, the successful fraud auditor is one who talks the auditees frequently, is available at audit site, and is known for protecting sources. So, dapat for you to be able to hone the fraud situations, you need to be available. So, in terms kung na mga questions, na mga clarifications, ang employees, as an auditor, as a controller, you need to be available to answer those queries and concerns. So, that ends our discussion for today. So, I'm just going to end our session with a quote by Wayne Dyer. You cannot always control what goes on outside, but you can always control what goes on inside. So if you're familiar with the 90-10 principle, it's the same with the internal control. Dili nimo makontrol ang mga ginabuhat sa tao na nakapalibot sa imuha, but you can always choose what to respond on them. You can always choose to control what inside you. So just like in business, no, in business you cannot control the inflation, you cannot control the bankruptcy of your company. If there is no a presence of bankruptcy, you cannot control the prices na i-offer sa other competitors businesses nimo, but you could always make internal control to be able to respond with those situations. So that is why internal control is very important as a controller, as a business owner, no? That you need to have those practices na relevant for the organization. So I guess that is the end for this discussion, and thank you so much for listening. If you have questions, no, I encourage you to comment it on the announcement that I will be posting in our G Classroom. So I guess thank you so much for listening. See you virtually.